Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition's House 802 community meeting for the month of May. My name is Justin Sursick, and I am the resident engagement AmeriCorps Vista for the coalition. Now, this is the fifth community meeting that we've held over Zoom since January when the legislative session began, where we took the time to bring a guest speaker, either a legislator or someone from the coalition who has been following legislation, to come and talk about in detail some of the bills that the coalition was advocating for, and what's in them, what they would do, and most importantly, what they would do to help average Vermonters, average tenants and homeowners like us. And now, as of May 12th, the legislature has concluded its work for both this legislative session this year and the biennium. So all of the bills that we're going to talk about had, if they had passed out of the House and the Senate, they've gone up to Governor Scott on the fifth floor in Montpelier for his signature, his approval, or his veto, which we're eagerly awaiting to hear news on, especially since this year has been rather unprecedented with the amount of funding that has come from the federal government through COVID relief, like the American Rescue Plan Act, and how that funding can be used to help us fight the housing crisis here in Vermont. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit first about the legislative priorities that the coalition had set out at the beginning of the year before the session started. From there, we'll move on to discuss the bills that were deliberated upon in the House and the Senate, and how those related to our priorities. And then we'll talk finally about what passed, what failed, and what's still up in the air for next year when the new biennium and the new legislative session begins. So first, to talk about the legislative priorities that the coalition had set out in December and January, right before the session began. So initially, this was made up of three pools: some major policy initiatives, major funding initiatives, and then lastly, justice, equity, and social safety net issues that were very well related to low income and affordable housing issues, but not necessarily directly tied to the development or the support of new affordable housing units. Regardless, though, these priorities were just as important, especially as they related to things such as housing discrimination, lowering energy and heating costs, which is both an environmental and a financial issue for working families, and also improving services to folks who need them as they live in affordable housing, such as recovery housing and recovery programs. So first, we're going to delve into some major policy bills that the coalition advocated for. First and foremost was rental housing safety, which was a big issue last year in the form of Senate Bill 79, which unfortunately was vetoed and was being considered for a veto override. However, legislators on both sides of the aisle and the governor were eager to continue to discuss and debate the matter and to try and come to a consensus and an agreement because of how important this issue is. So in regards to what the coalition wanted to see out of rental housing safety, essentially we had advocated for both a standardized and centralized inspection office run out of the State Department of Fire Safety, and funded consistently by a rental housing registry. So overall, this bill would, this concept of a centralized rental housing safety office would ensure healthy homes and families, and nothing too radical, but just rather compliance with existing laws and regulations around health and safety for rental units and housing. Along with that, the registry not only would have been a mechanism to fund this office, but also to gather a more accurate list of who our landlords are and where rental housing is in Vermont, especially so that when programs become available, such as rental assistance, COVID relief from ARPA, or even home improvement and repair grants and loans, that information could be distributed out to landlords and tenants so that they could take advantage of these state programs. Moving on from rental housing safety, another big policy initiative was the Just Cause charter change for the city of Burlington, which the coalition had worked for with many different organizations, including Rights and Democracy Vermont. So a few years back, the city of Burlington had overwhelmingly voted both in city council and in a citywide referendum to request a charter change from the state government to be permitted, so that the city would be permitted to adopt a just cause ordinance, essentially so that renters could only be evicted by a just cause, such as failure to pay rent, breach of written lease, breach of tenant responsibilities as established by state laws, criminal activity, rather than just being de facto evicted for no reason whatsoever, which is incredibly important in order to both for a low-income family to stay in their homes and stay in their communities, stay in their school districts, and also for the community, especially when we were facing an incredibly tight housing market, when it was hard to come by housing and rental units, which would be incredibly difficult for families to get evicted and then not be able to find housing whatsoever in the state. And the last major policy initiative that the coalition set out in its legislative priority was a streamlining of municipal permitting for water and wastewater connections to existing municipal systems in order to help expedite the development of new housing in downtowns and village centers and other designated areas. Moving on from major policy bills to major financing bills, the coalition was strongly advocating for full funding of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which is the main mechanism for funding of affordable housing developments by nonprofit and private developers across the state. Now, again, tying back to the American Rescue Plan Act and all this COVID relief that was available from the federal government, this funding was going to be unprecedented. However, the coalition was still advocated for full statutory funding from the state general fund, from Vermont's state funding of $30.8 million, regardless of how many ARPA dollars were set aside and made available for affordable housing. This was both to really acknowledge the severity of the housing crisis and our ability to fight back incredibly strongly at this time. And then also too, because of concerns from some advocates and from legislators that there might be issues with for developments and projects with trying to combine both of those funding streams together to take money from the federal government and from the state government in the same project. Moving on from VHCB, another big financing priority for the coalition was a tax credit expansion for the mobile home down payment program, which is a statewide program run out of the Champlain Housing Trust. They manage this program to help provide loans to low-income mobile home park residents to replace their older homes with new energy efficient models in order to both improve health and safety from the elements and to help lower energy costs, which could mean all the difference, especially with Vermont winters. The coalition advocated for the legislature to expand this tax credit program specifically in order to help families upgrade these units and secure units of their own. Lastly, in terms of the major financing priorities that the coalition set out was continued funding and even expansions to the SASH program, the Support and Services at Home program, which coordinates social service agencies, healthcare providers, and nonprofit housing organizations to primarily help older Vermonters. Along with these major legislative priorities, there are plenty of other issues that the coalition advocated for that were either more closely related to housing, such as recovery residences or fighting against housing discrimination, to other issues such as childcare and supporting a $15 per hour minimum wage. Both are very important for helping families and folks, regular Vermonters, secure housing, rentals, and home ownership opportunities. So now moving on to the bills that were actually introduced into the session when the legislators got to Montpelier in January. Ultimately, there were 8 major bills that the coalition was following and advocating for. 6 of these very closely aligned to the priorities that the coalition had set out in December. And 2 of these were also major priorities that we supported and advocated for that were introduced by legislators. So to first tie into what we had just discussed, some of these priorities that the coalition set out, some of the bills that we advocated for included H708, House Bill 708, which was the charter change for just cause eviction in the city of Burlington. Another one was House Bill 329, which was the housing discrimination bill, which aided plaintiffs in housing and employment discrimination civil suits by both standardizing the statute of limitations to a full 6 years instead of 3 years, and also clarifying what had been described by advocates as a flawed, severe, and pervasive standard, which was set by the Supreme Court for discrimination suits, but often was incredibly vague and hard to prove because it wasn't standardized. Moving on to S101, Senate Bill 101. This included the Bylaw Modernization Grant Act, which would have assisted municipalities in updating their land use and development bylaws to support development patterns that is pedestrian oriented and consistent with smart growth. So especially important among this is water wastewater connection issues like we discussed earlier in some of the legislative priorities, streamlining the permitting process so that development can happen more expeditiously. And also included in this was the mobile home down payment tax credit program, as we discussed. Moving on to the next bill, H211, House Bill 211, which was known as the Recovery Residence Bill, which helped to establish landlord-tenant relationships for these forms of housing, while also stipulating certain rules for lease agreements so that relapse did not lead to eviction or homelessness, while also providing mechanisms to help protect other residents that were living in that home at the time, going through a recovery program. A state certification process would have allowed for this standard to be enforced among these residences across the state. Moving on from there to the budget adjustment bill, H679, which provided $40 million to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board Trust Fund, which was made up of both funding from the general fund and also from federal funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. Again, this was a highly unprecedented level of funding for VHCB, but unfortunately did not include full statutory funding from the general fund for the trust fund. And then lastly is Senate Bill 210, which was the, as I believe we had mentioned earlier, the rental housing safety bill. Now moving on from there, there was 2 tremendously important pieces of legislation that were brought forth by legislators that the coalition supported because they matched the overall mission and values and goals of the coalition and its members. So the first among these was Senate Bill 226, the large omnibus housing bill, just because it contained quite a lot of new programs and ideas and funding. Among these included a missing middle program, which was lauded by both legislators and the governor, which was essentially a pilot program of $15 million for housing that would target folks that had up to 80 to 120% AMI, so low and moderate income folks, especially just because the cost of housing has become so exorbitant that it's even hard for moderate income Vermonters to find housing on the market that's affordable, which then just makes the market even tighter and makes it harder for everyone to find housing. Overall, this funding would have subsidize the construction of smaller starter homes that were too expensive for contractors to build, for these developers to build, and also would have placed equity from this funding into the home to make it easier for families to purchase, to become homeowners. Included in this bill was also a home contractor registry, which the governor had opposed, which would have required contractors to register with the government, with the state government, to help keep tabs, to gather information about what the contractor landscape looks like in Vermont, so that lawmakers could discuss it more in depth in future years. Moving on from that, also included in the omnibus bill was an improvement and replacement program for manufactured homes, around $4 million, both for units and also for other infrastructure that's needed for constructing and placing mobile homes, manufactured homes, such as cement foundation pads. Moving on, there were $200,000 set aside to create a land access and opportunity board, which would help advise the state on how to promote home ownership for people who have been historically marginalized and for whom it's been harder historically to find housing, such as the BIPOC community. There were $20 million in funds appropriated for the repair and renovation of housing. So essentially for homes that could potentially be rented or lived in that were just in utter disrepair and uninhabitable, which there's quite a few, since the housing stock in Vermont is in fact quite old. This funding also incentivizes not only just bringing older units online, but also the development of accessory dwelling units on properties. So these are detached garages with an apartment up top or a little cottage on a property that could be rented out to folks to live in. And then lastly, another addition to the omnibus housing bill was another measure to provide more time for homeowners behind on municipal property taxes to apply for the Vermont Housing and Finance Agency's home ownership program. So now moving on from the omnibus bill, the other major bill that legislators had proposed was S-234, Senate Bill 234, which would have introduced some changes to Vermont's longstanding land use law, Act 250, which has been so incredibly important to helping to protect Vermont's environment and scenic views, and to help prevent urban and suburban sprawl at the same time. So ultimately, the permitting process was vigorous for both Act 250 and then on top of that, municipal permitting for new developments and new housing. And legislators and the governor had feared that this process might be an impediment to using ARPA money from the American Rescue Plan Act to create new housing, since these federal funds had a deadline of 2 or 3 years. So that essentially, I believe longer, actually 5 years. But regardless, it was on a deadline, so that if the funds weren't expended by a certain amount of time on projects, that money would go back to the federal government and would not be able to be used by Vermont to construct new housing. So to accomplish all of this, Senate Bill 234 would have exempted development of mixed income housing, known as priority housing projects, in certain designated areas that are a part of historic settlement patterns. So such as designated downtown areas, village and town centers, new town centers. So essentially, this would have promoted density, more denser housing in areas that are already developed and already inhabited, instead of taking up more unused open land unnecessarily. The bill also included a number of other non-housing measures aimed at conservation, ranging from forest fragmentation rules to regulations around private roadways, to reforms to Vermont's Natural Resources Board and the Agency of Natural Resources. So yeah, so that was a lot of legislation to go over. And luckily, too, a lot of these bills were talked about more in depth by the coalition during our community meetings, which are all available on YouTube. So if you want to learn more about, say, H708, just cause eviction charter change, or H329 about the discrimination bill, those videos are up and available for you to view to learn more. So now moving on to the end results of the legislative session, which we have a generally a good idea of what the end results are, though we are still awaiting a number of bills to be transmitted from the state house to the governor for his signature or his veto. So we're eagerly awaiting news of those. But we have a general idea, like I said, of the bills that passed, the bills that were vetoed or that we expect the governor to veto, and also bills that did not advance past the state house to the governor's desk. So first to the good news, the bills that passed or that we expect to pass. So we expect S226, the omnibus bill, to pass and be signed by the governor, which will be fantastic as it puts so much unprecedented funding into housing with new programs and ideas and expansions to old programs too. And especially as legislators scaled back the statewide contractor registry program that the governor had disapproved of, so that only contractors who take on projects that exceed $10,000 would be required to participate in the registry. It's really likely that the governor will sign this into law, which is great news. S210, the rental housing safety bill will likely be signed as well, as the rental housing registry was removed from the bill. So funding, instead of being secured with the registry, is temporary through money from the American Rescue Plan instead. So it will be up to the legislature and the governor in years to come to see how the program does and to decide how to continue funding it. And then it's up to us as advocates in a coalition to fight for it too. So yeah, ultimately it is incredibly likely that this will be signed into law as well, because that registry was removed. Moving on, the one thing that we know definitely was signed was the budget adjustment, H679, which was signed into law by the governor earlier in the session. So all of that funding for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board was secured. And then lastly, we have House Bill 510, which essentially became the vehicle for all of the programs and the policies that were in Senate Bill 101. So that was the municipal bylaw grant, along with the mobile home down payment tax credit program. So essentially, on occasion, bills are moved from, policies and programs are moved from bill to bill to find a vehicle to get through past the state house to the governor. And also just to make it easier for legislators so that they can vote more quickly. So these two programs were put into H510, which was mainly the vehicle for the Vermont's child tax credit program. And it's likely that that will be signed by the governor as well. Now to move on to what has been vetoed, what's been threatened to be vetoed, and what probably will be vetoed. So first is Senate Bill 234, which was that Act 250 bill. While the governor was while the governor had fought for some of those exemptions to Act 250 in designated areas so that development of housing would be more expedient, he was very much opposed to some of the conservation measures, including the forest block fragmentation regulations, and some of the rules around the construction or the permitting for private driveways or roads on private property. However, even though it is likely that S234 will be vetoed, the policies that the governor had approved of were moved at the last minute by legislators from S234 to the omnibus housing bill. So thankfully, those measures will also likely be passed into law as part of the omnibus bill. And then to the other piece of legislation that was definitely vetoed by the governor was House Bill 708, which was the charter change for the city of Burlington to enact a just cause ordinance, which is quite unfortunate as this measure had so much popular support, both from not just city council, from elected officials, but also from the people of Burlington by incredibly wide margins in a citywide referendum. Unfortunately, though, after the veto, there was a veto override vote, which failed in the House only by one single vote, just one member. So unfortunately, that bill was vetoed this session. Now to move on to some bills that did not advance past the state house to the governors. We had H329, which was the anti-discrimination bill, the housing discrimination bill, which unfortunately did not make it to crossover, which is the halfway point in the legislative session, where bills are expected to finish their work in one chamber where they started. So they were heard in committees and voted on, and then voted on the floor, and transmitted over to the next chamber so that they have enough time to consider those bills and to deliberate upon them and to vote for them before the session ends. So unfortunately, H329 did not make it this time around, but hopefully, especially as there is interest from legislators, it will be brought up again in a future session and hopefully reintroduced. Moving on, as I had said before, that S101 did not go anywhere, but those provisions got moved onto H510, which will be passed. And then lastly, House Bill 211, the Recovery Residence Bill, did not see any leeway this year. And yeah, so hopefully, even though we saw some vetoes, and even though we saw some legislation that did not quite make it to the governor's desk, there was a lot that was done this year for affordable housing in Vermont to fight the housing crisis and for low and moderate income Vermonters. So I think that is quite a success. However, there's always more work to be done, especially when we talk about those vetoed bills and those bills that didn't make it, which is why the coalition is so excited to start planning for next January, where we're going to have a new biennium after a governor's election and after elections for statewide executive officers, and a very large election season for the state house, as we have a lot of members of both the Senate and the House that are retiring this year or leaving their post. So there's going to be a lot of new faces, new ideas, new energy, and new ability to continue to fight for affordable housing. So it's going to be, there's a lot to look forward to as some of these policies and programs that were signed into law start to be implemented and we prepare for next year. So with that, I'm going to take a quick pause just because I talked a lot. And seeing as we have a very small Zoom tonight, Buster, if you have any questions that I can try and answer if you want to talk, though I'm definitely not an expert at all.
Hi, Justin. I'm trying to digest everything you had said.
It's quite a lot, yeah. Luckily,
yes.
too, this was just a precursor. This was a little sampling of the legislative wrap-up, the document that the coalition is going to produce and release soon. So again, for you and for our audience on YouTube, please do follow the coalition's website, www.vtaffordablehousing.org, and our social media for when that's released. But yeah, Buster, it is definitely it is a lot of stuff. And it was so interesting for me to being new to Vermont politics, and how things work at the state level, to see kind of how lawmakers work with each other and made sure that different programs and proposals found their way through different bills, even if there was problems with certain bills, that some of those aspects still made it into other bills, which was really great, especially the mobile home tax credit program, which is a program that I'm more familiar with, and very appreciative of.
Yes, yes. Question.
I'll try and answer.
Um, it's very challenging for me. I know one of our legislators' priorities as a coalition is safe, affordable housing for farm workers.
Mhm.
And
Okay, you cut off a little bit. I heard the safe, affordable housing for farm workers, Buster, but I didn't hear what came after that.
I've been advocating that generated by Champlain. Sorry about that. Anyways, bear with me while I get a better connection.
Sure.
But I mostly want to make sure that this new repair program is ongoing, because it took several years to get to such bad conditions, and it's going to take several years for those improvements to not only take effect, but it'll take several years of ongoing work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if they added any more funding than the 1.2 million from last year that started it. So they started out with 1.2 million, and we've been advocating that for there to be more. So I'm just looking forward to all this awesome work that's being generated on that part, because we know farm workers, as well as the BIPOC community and many others, are left out of that conversation.
Yeah, definitely, Buster. I know there's a few articles that I was reading too, about some of the legislation that was passed that commented on how, even though we have the funding, we have the money now, that it's still going to take a lot of time for it to go through the bureaucracy and to get doled out, and then for the construction to actually happen and for repairs to actually be made. So I think that all we can really do now is just make sure that we continue to spread the word about these programs that are available for folks, so that they know that they exist and they can take advantage of them while the money's still there. And then go back in the next session and continue to advocate for continued funding to make sure that we have those programs, that they still exist, especially as, like I said before, Vermont's housing stock is incredibly old. So a lot of these repair and improvement programs are incredibly important to make sure that the housing that we already have doesn't decay anymore and can actually be used by families and farm workers and other folks. So I think you can definitely expect to hear about that through the summer months as the coalition starts to talk about next year and what our legislative priorities are and what we need to fight for.
Yes, yes, a lot of ongoing work, and it's never ending. Like I mentioned to someone the other day, as we were talking, and I was like, for me, me personally, advocacy doesn't take a day off.
No.
And this coalition doesn't take a day off. And I appreciate everything. And yes, yes. And thank you for all your work, Justin.
Thank you, Buster. Appreciate it. Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure to serve as a Vista at the coalition. So there's so much important work that goes on. So yeah, so with that, I will plug once more for our audience listening on YouTube that we have video recordings of all of our past community meetings where we talk more in depth with legislators and coalition members about some of these very important legislative priorities for the past 5 months. All of that is available on YouTube. And there is more information to come. Our legislative wrap up on our website, www.vtaffordablehousing.org. And then, of course, our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook as well. So with that, thank you all for listening. Really appreciate your time. And I think I could say that the coalition looks forward to fighting and advocating with you all in the next year to come as the next session comes along and we continue to fight against the housing crisis. So with that, thank you and good night.